It's YNK, so since I stole all of Thorin's gigs, at the very least, what you guys can do is subscribe to his YouTube channel, so go on and do it right now.
Okay, this is going to be episode 17 of Esports Salon. Usual host, Thorin. Going to go around the panel here. I'll do the topic first, because obviously it's less interesting if you just do the people and then say the topic at the end. So this is going to be an episode about esports contracts. Don't tune out just yet. Like, tune out in about 5 minutes if it starts off really shit and they're really boring. It could be, I don't fucking know, look at the panel I've got. So if it's terrible in 10 minutes, tune out then. But give it a shot. Listen, this is important. Like, this, people's lives and future livelihoods, image rights across the known universe and such terms might actually be asked about. You might learn something. So that the next time you sat there like a pleb and you go, why doesn't Cloud9 just buy all the players that I think are good? Well, then you'll know. Turns out there's a whole sort of like piece of paper and a quill or something like that. And then, I don't know, somehow that means that you can't have all the good players and you have to just fluke majors. But anyway, let's just start the episode, shall we? It's going to be about contracts. Right, in the top right-hand corner, coming in with heat immediately, it's Bryce Blum, a.k.a. Esports Law. And he obviously is a founding partner at ESG Law. But again, hang in there. He's actually got something of a personality, I mean, there was actually that one talk show. I don't even remember the name of the talk show, Bryce. What was that one that we both went on? I think it's like a dead show now, where they invited us on to talk about franchising or something. And I think all we did was just argue with each other and not even let the other people on the show talk for about half an hour. Do you remember the show?
I do, and there's a great, if you go back and watch go back and look on the Twitch chat, Risen Lazarus told me after the fact that he was keeping score on who was like a boxing match, who was scoring blows throughout. So the way he scored it, you got me pretty good early, and I think I ended up by up a round by the time it was all said and done, so I'll take it.
That would make sense, because here's the thing, I can come with some good banter initially, but to be fair, I don't ever pretend I actually know anything about specialist subjects. At some point in time, you hit the bottom and you realise, all the style of the world doesn't make up for a little bit of substance.
Yep.
So anyway, Bryce here, I would say one of the good guys, but who can really know, right? I guess that's sort of written at the end of the book, We've still got a lot of chapters to go, Bryce. So for now, you're killing it. Now you seem like one of the good guys, but there could be, that's what I've learned in this business, there could be a sharp heel turn in Act 3. So I'm pulling against it personally. Or am I? I don't know. Maybe you've sown seeds of dissent across the whole industry. You'll just wrap this motherfucker up one day. I don't know. So anyway, in the bottom right-hand corner, we've got Anna Baumann, aka Esports Law EU, because there'll always be derivatives, and Europe does require its own sort of jurisdiction, magisterium, as it were. It's a totally different world. Well, then again, so is California, just from everywhere else, right? So I guess everyone needs to be a specialist in some way, right? She doesn't actually have. You don't actually have your own legal outfit that's just for esports, right, Anna? You actually work in the real world, and then you just do some stuff online or something.
No, I wouldn't say that. I mean, I have my legal practice of focusing on esports only nowadays, just because, there is so much work to do.
Fair. What's the name of this practice?
Well, it's German, actually, and it says Esports Rechtsberatung. So there you go, and try yourself on that name. And
Close right off.
He actually knew that. He just didn't want to say it. So this is clever roundabout way to you to say it.
I get it. But there are a couple of mini jobs I also do. I advise the German Esports Association, and I work with the Esports Integrity Coalition, as do many in ours.
Okay.
So yeah.
Fair enough. Okay. So yes, as you might have been able to tell, dear viewer, Anna is German and a lawyer. So listen, barrel of laughs, obviously incredible personality, known for banter. And also, as she says, though, to be serious, she has to work within Germany, working with esports law. So that's like being in like a fucking one of those like chaos marines in the fucking Warhammer universe where everyone just considers you impure and you should be destroyed, basically. So if she survived this long, she must know what she's doing. That's all I'm going to say. Not least because EU is still a train wreck, especially in the LCS. So, obviously, rounding out the panel, it's my main man, Scoots. And here's the thing, he's actually been invited to this episode. He hasn't just, come in like the super sub when certain people, again, won't name who, but people who don't turn up to shows.
I had some time to think about it, yeah.
Yeah. But here's the thing, though. You actually did get that episode, Scoots, because the good thing was, obviously, we just let like Noah and Carmack fight over, again, just not always the best stuff, but whatever. They had their battle. And at the end, what's great is you did come in and you had sort of like the closing remarks that brought everything together and left us with a mess. You perfectly played the Jerry Springer role like I asked you to. You nailed it, Scoots.
I'm here for you, man. I'm here for you.
Okay. So obviously, SirScoots, industry icon. Previously worked in a big team, so who knows, maybe he's fucking the players. I don't know what they do in these teams. He's now advocating for players because, again, I don't know, maybe this is like evening up the scales at the end. He's like, right, better do some good on the way out the door. Otherwise, the final summation might be rough on this one. Also involved with companies that were sold, like Gotfrag and Twitch, so we know everything went perfectly fine with all those deals. All those companies are great to this day. Definitely nothing dodgy going on there. But here's the good thing. I will say this. One thing you can't deny when you talk about Scoots is these companies are way better than when he's at them. Like, he knows exactly when to jump off that train that's going off the track and the bridge that's not there, He always lands on his feet. So he's, again, obviously knows what direction this industry's heading in. So Scoots, let's start there, actually.
All right.
Since you were someone whose public engagement with esports predates the rest of them, and you were someone who was working with a team and Evil Geniuses, back in the days when even Evil Geniuses got big, so we're talking like end of the 2000s, obviously hitting its prime in the early 2000s, 2010 rather, were the contract aspects of the business like formed at this point in time? Did people have the same contract in every sort of team and it was just reworded with a different name of the team? How developed was that sort of stuff when we were at Evil Geniuses?
I would say, yeah, come Evil Geniuses kind of come into its own even before when I got there, but certainly if you talk about like the end of 1.6, the StarCraft 2 days when a little bit more exposure for everybody started coming in the scene, by all means, we had independent contractor contracts. Now there's a lot to be said about even the legality of those in the sense of if a prime person with your business is an employee or a contractor, right? So, but in its context of it being legal in that sense, there were a lot of the big companies and teams had contracts. It still, though, begs the question, having the piece of paper doesn't necessarily mean everything on the paper was necessarily legal. Sure. Whether the people that created it on the team side really had proper legal assistance themselves to put these clauses together, let alone if the player had anyone of knowledge to read it, to advise on it. But certainly, we were all contracting back then. I would say, and I don't think anyone would disagree, that back then the contracts were even more team-sided, more one way, because you were lucky to get any money, let alone get travel and gear to play a video game, right? I don't think the world embraced what we kind of all saw in the sense of a skill set there, but like the reward for it, right? Obviously, teams can't pay till they can make money to pay. We started to pay, and obviously now they all get paid. So to answer your question, yeah, there were certainly all sorts of levels of contracts out there between teams and players, probably less so between teams than anybody else other than sponsors, right? Okay. In the sense of like, you weren't having deals with the ESLs of the world or the CALs of the world, in the sense of like tournament organizer deals, rev share deals. Like it was, team to player and team to sponsors, right? We contract them, they give us money. We contract you, we give you some of that money. And now it's obviously the fact you're even having this podcast with two lawyers on a global scale, one very much representing, I would say, team side more than player side, and one I would say that represents more the player side of the equation, but both very much accredited lawyers. That's awesome. We didn't have that years ago, right? In this space at all. Dedicated legal help.
Okay.
And I can actually chime in there really quickly, Thorin, because the first player contract I ever looked at was on behalf of an Evil Geniuses player at the very beginning of 2014, and so I saw what that contract looked like, and it was a bloodbath. It looked like there was legal language in there. There was some perpetuity and some hithertos and all that good jazz.
Lots of
hithertos and hair forethought tows and.
Yes, for sure. And but in terms of it's not even about whether or not I get all the time the question, is this legal? Like it just because this whole thing is about contracts, right? At least under US law, you really only need 3 basic things to be a legally binding contract. You need offer, acceptance, and consideration. All that means is like, I've put something concrete on the table for you. You have concretely accepted that thing. And there is some bargain for exchange. I'm getting something, you're getting something. So if I sign a contract that says I'm going to give Thorin $1 million in exchange for nothing, that's not an enforceable contract because it lacks consideration. He's getting $1 million, I'm getting nothing. So that's the basic. So in the basic sense, these were legally binding contracts, but in terms of what they were and what was the coverage and did it make sense? I mean, it was some haphazardly put together standard independent contractor template, which had a few things that were sprinkled in there. It was like clearly someone had thought about how and this should apply to esports, but it was missing a whole host of coverage for the ways in which players and teams interact with one another. And a lot of things were just assumed, right? It was just not part of the contract. The contract was like 3 pages long or 5 pages long. I don't even remember. Whereas my standard player contract today is like 40 pages long. Yeah, big difference. So a lot has changed. Yeah,
I mean, if you remember, Thorin, like back in the day, if you remember when Siege was running around that CPL yelling at Craig Levine because his player had signed a contract and he was waving in his face, like the whole method, right? All that drama over that, right? So, and I think, and again, like one thing I didn't do with EG was like the business side. I didn't walk into boardrooms with Alex. I didn't pitch sponsors other than cocktail parties or whatever. And I didn't really deal with the business legal side of it. So I would imagine if you asked Alex, his first contract he got from somebody else started jerry-rigging it, adding clauses, changing clauses. People grabbed EGs, did the same thing. I think now if you look at contracts, you see Bryce's language all over all of them, right? He is the new kind of default standard of a team-to-player contract, right? But at least it's now, I think, cemented in more of an esports-focused compromise of both sides, maybe, than it ever has been, right? But again, so I think they've come a long way. And again, even the fact that we have esports-specific lawyers who are learning labor laws and all these things and entertainment laws, how they pertain to this world is fairly new, right? Which is certainly going to impact these contracts right away, right? Not only contracts with players, but I'm sure Bryce does probably more work with contracts to sponsors and those kind of things as they relate to a Liquid or a Cloud9 or whoever, then I imagine he has to address the player side of it once in a while for nuances here and there. But that's probably a new level of like standard boilerplate that we're at, I would think. I mean, I've seen a lot of them too, and they're all very similar now because I think they're kind of being accepted. So now you're not debating the language and the clause. You're debating the nuances of it. Okay, how much is that salary? How much is this? How much is that? What is the release? But it's not like this clause sucks anymore, right? I think. And obviously Bryce does this every day, so he can certainly speak, and so does Anna on the player side. Maybe I can say that's probably the main, case in the US. I think in Europe it's quite different. For once, you have, many jurisdictions, and those handle esports very differently. You have France, for example. They even now have a statutory law that regulates esports. Esports athletes are qualified, for example, as a certain type of employee. So if you draft agreements in that jurisdiction, it has to comply with these laws. And same for Germany, for example. I think here probably more or less employment law as you would apply to traditional athletes, mainly football players, probably also applies to again esports athletes, and I think to players. And we're running into, at least I think in Europe, into big problems and issues because also the game publishers or tournament organizers, they actually regulate the space, and sometimes they regulate the space in a way that they actually restrict workers' rights to a degree that is questionable. So I think it's going to be very interesting, moving forward, particularly in Germany, lovely country, big with employment protection, employee protection. So it's going to be interesting.
For those keeping score at home, questionable is lawyers speak for. It's long, it's complicated, it's probably not okay, but boy, you don't want me to go on this diatribe right now.
Well, obviously, I can give you an easy example, right? So take the European LCS, for example. We previously had a structure where you had the Challenger League and the LCS, and Challenger actually ended, I think, 3 or 4 months before LCS ended. Unfortunately, the transfer rules apply to both player groups, to the Challenger group and to the LCS player group. And if you are actually in this pool of players, it means that you can only sign a new contract during free agencies, which are 2 windows, during the year. So obviously, a couple of players in Challenger were prevented from, signing new employment contracts during a certain phase. And, that's no secret. There was, there is the player contract database. So you could see that was actually happening. And I think that is a very, obvious example where you could say, okay, this type of regulation is actually, would not hold up in court, honestly, because it prevents players from actively doing their job, working and earning their living.
Okay. So one aspect to this discussion, if we think about how the layman is going to consider contracts, is basically what you alluded to there, Bryce, which is the idea that it's not about whether it's a legal contract. People think that there's a set, there's rules for all these sorts of things. Whereas obviously, first of all, when it pertains to esports, there was no history. There's no precedents anyone was going off many years ago. Obviously, how you interpret what your employment is and what capacity you do it in is going to be a different factor. So when you hear the fan talk about contracts, he's going to think naively what a lot of us did a long time ago, which is that all you can really do is change the contract at the beginning, as though, if you signed one a year ago that you were a young player, you signed one, you didn't think about it, and it turns out now it's terrible. A lot of people, even to this day, would probably think, oh, that's a shame, you should have saw someone beforehand. It doesn't matter if what it contains in the contract's ridiculous, and there's no way you could live off this, or you couldn't, it being impossible to enforce. They will think naively, well, I did agree to that, I signed it. Right? When you started out in this business, Bryce, how much of the contracts being what people would now consider shady or potentially exploitative, how much was the companies themselves didn't know and they'd just basically gotten a default version, and they'd just given it to everyone, or they'd gotten theirs from someone else they'd seen, very simple stuff like that? And how much was people initially using that aspect to their advantage? Because on the one hand, I would have actually told people, no one's really enforcing any of these contracts at the time. I mean, as much as that guy can say, oh, I've got you on here, it's unless he's going to take you to court, he hasn't got anything. Yeah. But at the same time, just the threat of that is basically what did make these things stay in place in the early days, and people thinking that they had to honor everything in them. So what was it like in the beginning?
Yeah, it's actually a really good question, because this is responsible for my transition from the player side to the team side. I can tell you, I can pinpoint the moment that, so when I started, I was doing mostly work with players. My first 10 esports clients were all professional players. And I remember the exact moment I decided I wanted to flip sides. And that moment, I came to esports as a fan. I had followed for a while, back in the day in early StarCraft Brood War, I played CS in high school. I mean, I'm like everyone else who played CS for 20 years, whatever, right? Much to my parents' chagrin. And so when I started transitioning into working in the space professionally, I had the fan mentality of every org owner is trying to exploit these kids and they must all be evil. And what I found, there was this pivotal moment in which I got a player contract working on behalf of a very major LCS player at the time. This has been 2014, and spent forever going back and forth on that contract with the player, internally with sports lawyers and entertainment lawyers at my big corporate law firm where I was working. Went back and forth with the team owner, because back then, there weren't these bloated staffs for all these teams. It was if you're negotiating with on behalf of a serious LCS player, you're negotiating with Alex Garfield, right? You're negotiating with the CEO of whatever team you're talking to. And we went back and forth, and I remember getting to the end of that, and but when we had started, I had said to the player, hey, there's a lot of stuff wrong here that I'm immediately noticing. Just tell your players not to sign it, and when we're done, we can ask the team owner to like produce new copies for all of the players on the team to get them on more reasonable and fair language. Had a really actually beneficial back and forth. The team owner shed light on a lot of why a lot of things in the contract were really unfair, like they misunderstood it or they never even thought about it, and I was able to explain to them like, hey, as it turns out, you don't need perpetual exclusive IP rights. What you need is non-exclusive IP rights that are perpetual solely to the extent it's in a fixed media during the term. After that, you don't need to or do you intend to make new merchandise with my player's face on it after the term? No, you don't actually need perpetual right. If you already put their face on something and you want to sell off period, fine. If they're already in a video and you want historical reference purposes, fine. This is a long-winded story by way of saying we got to the end of the rainbow. The team owner thanked me so much for the hard work and said, this is going to be my new standard player contract across the board. I said, oh, great. Would you mind actually, I had mentioned to my, ex-client about the other players, can you change it for those 4 players as well? And he goes, actually, they already signed it, so I don't really want to go back and deal with that hassle. And I went to the players, like, what happened? And he was like, yeah, they just couldn't be bothered to wait. Like, they were just kind of wanted it done. And I was like, someone tells you it is terrible. They tell you they will give you free legal work. You don't have to do anything. Just sit there and get a better contract. And they couldn't even wait like 2 weeks for it to be done. So in that moment, with that experience with that team owner, when he reached out to me and said, I would love your advice on X, Y, Z, other things that we're working on, I said, absolutely. And when more teams came my way, it just became, I felt like I was going to be able to have as Scoots is saying, I really do believe like the standard player contract that's out there right now is the contract that I wrote from scratch 4 years ago. It dawned on me there was no way I was going to have that impact if I stayed on the player side. I needed to get to the org side. I needed to affect across all the different games. And in coming to learn that not every org owner was evil, I was able to actually do that work. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some evil org owners. They're few and far between these days. They were a little bit more common then. In the entire course of my practice, I've had to separate relationships with 2 clients. I won't name them, but you probably can actually, if you went back and pieced it together, could figure out who they were, where it just became very clear to me these were not business people that I wanted to be working with or for. They did not share my values, and so I couldn't do it. But that was the exception, not the rule, even back in 2014. Okay.
So Anna, this is a question I have that relates to that. Is like, if these were just standard boilerplate contracts and people, for example, just misapplied them, they were for one area of the law and then they just took it and they made it for everyone in their org, took it like a different variant of this, right? Even if it's not just being evil, understandably, if you're the org owner, you want to get everything you can get out of the deal and secure everything on your side, in theory, in case you have to enforce it. When people hear these terms like you're signing rights in perpetuity, I mean, I joked there, but I've seen real contracts that they say, the rights extend across the known universe. I believe that was actually a term in one. These sound like outrageous terms if you're just a layman. It basically sounds like some comical signing away of your soul with blood on a piece of, I think it's the back of child or something was the old reference back in the day. Are these as worrying as they sound?
Well, some of them certainly not in Europe, just because usually when you end up in a potentially contentious situation, where you're going to fight with the opposing party. For example, when I represent a player and you're going to fight over any kind of clause in there, usually you do that when something was signed, as we heard 2 years ago. Now the player isn't happy anymore for whatever reason. And usually they come and say hey, can you get me out of my contract, right? And you look at this contract and, I believe that actually all owners have learned over the past years that a contract like that is really not worth it, just because when it comes to this situation and your player is represented by a lawyer, it's very likely that you lose your players. Whether this is, in the course of a negotiation, whether this is, even, before court. So, for example, I met, a couple of them, in procedures. Obviously, we wouldn't know because it's all confidential. But, in the end, it always goes the same way. And then, in the end, usually you get a very friendly call a couple of weeks after, and they ask you, hey, can you help me with the contract? Because I don't want to be in the situation anymore. Okay. So, but in any event, the other learning, lesson, particularly players should learn from that is sometimes your lawyer will not be able to get you out, and please take care of your own affairs. This is your life, and obviously we have said this 1,000 times, but really this is your life, this is your career. Take care of yourself, think about what you really want in life, and get the support people who help you getting, where you want to be in your life. So, yeah.
Yes, I believe the term was "protect your neck" by the Wu-Tang Clan. That's like the motto I live by, Scoots.
Yeah, and I think something to be said for team owners too, whether it's Garfield and myself and guys around back in the day, Lake, Torvald, Lake's still around, obviously, or even now. These contracts, I don't think were ever meant to be all-encompassing and one-sided to be evil or malicious. The idea, and it's less now, thankfully, for team owners, but back then, the rev stream was walk into SteelSeries' door and get as much goddamn money from him as possible, and you had to own everything below you to represent that to get that money. So you can't ask SteelSeries, hey, give me 250 grand this year, man. Let's do some crazy shit, and then not have the ability to grab Jordan, Nothing Gilbert, and go, and here's Jordan, and here's this guy. So Jordan has to kind of give that up for you to sell it, but that was our only revenue stream, right? We had to get that, so you had to own the entire little ball to go sell that ball and put logos all over it. But now you've got a variety of revenue streams for team owners, tournament organizers, rev streams. Merch is way more than it's ever been. Obviously, there's different revenue streams with streamers and stuff. Players themselves have different revenue streams. So I think that in itself has allowed the contracts to get a little bit less one-sided, right? The owners are giving stuff up, right? Now they're paying a shitload of money, no doubt about that. And depending on the game, maybe even overpaying some players and some salaries. But it's not as one-sided as it used to be, and it certainly, I don't think, was ever, at least the owners that I know and respect back then. Again, to Bryce's point, there were shady ones. They're gone now. Thorin, you know them. I know them from back in the day. They're all gone, right? Sure. That spotlight is too intense now for an asshole like that to stick around, right? It doesn't happen, right?
Yeah.
Thankfully.
I think that's, not right in its entirety. The more players make, the more, hands open up to also get a piece of the pie.
Absolutely.
And I do believe, the more money you make, no matter whether you're, an esports player or someone else, the more attention you should actually pay, what's happening in your life. Just to give you an example, I think, there are a couple of things that are happening in pro sport and, even considered shady. And I think they will, if they haven't arrived yet in esports, they will come. So, for example, I will give you a couple of examples. For example, third-party partnership, where people actually, this is a construct where people bet on transfer fees, where a player will go. And these third parties then, have the power, for example, to block player transfers. So this is something, I think it's now banned by FIFA, but I have seen, business models like this already, coming over my desk. Not really a fan. So this is one thing. The other thing is, we talked about these image rights and in perpetuity, worldwide, etc. pp. Obviously, in professional sports, it's a very common model that you assign all your image rights to an agency, and they will, actually exploit all commercial rights for you. It usually makes sense, very much as it makes sense, for example, for a film star. But on the other hand, you have to be very careful, because if this, contract is quite intense and has and goes for a long time, it might mean that your agency can let you rot with one team, or and you don't have much influence over your image rights anymore for a couple of years. So overall, I think the more money is in it, yes, professionalization goes up, but greedy people also move in.
Yeah, and Anna's talking a lot about kind of third-party leeches on the space, right? Like agents that are going to take away exclusive IP rights from a player and just sit on them or not really help you monetize them. I think, Thorin, to your kind of core original question around is some of this stuff as scary as it sounds? The word perpetuity gets thrown around a lot as like the scary word, like never sign away image rights in perpetuity. That's just wrong, right? Like that's just people not understanding what any of this stuff means. Signing away perpetual name, image, likeness rights is fine as long as, one, it's not exclusive. There's no reason for it to be exclusive in the context of a team. Your team does not need your exclusive IP rights. If enforced, that could prevent you from like tweeting a picture of yourself, right? Now, they do actually need the rights to be perpetual for like really obvious examples, right? Like if they don't have perpetual image rights, then literally every picture they took of you while you were there, every sponsor photo shoot you did, whatever, the moment your contract with them ends, they can't do anything. They have to go on and literally remove every social media post, every piece of content that contains your name, image, likeness. The key is about the scope of the perpetual rights grant. They need those rights to be perpetual to the extent they are taking videos, pictures, social media posts, whatever you're doing, basically all the rendering of the services during the term, they need those rights to be in perpetuity. They do not need a unlimited blanket rights grant to your name, image, likeness in perpetuity. That would give them the ability to 2 years after the term. And by the way, some players did this, right? I remember talking to like Snoop back in the day when I was first working with him about some old team that he was working on before EG that was like still printing mouse pads with his face on it and selling them. They don't need those rights. You're not intending to grant those rights. And what I found in working with some of these teams early on, Scoots is right. Like the contracts are less one-sided now, in part because like better negotiations, better representation, better thoughtfulness, but in part because people didn't even, like the owners didn't even know what they were doing. Like you would talk and be like, oh, I don't need those rights. Yeah, I'm totally fine with that edit. Like that's no problem at all. I would of course never do that. So there's absolute exploitative language out there. I still see it sometimes to this day, but I also think a lot of the time language that makes a heck of a lot of sense and there's really no other way to do it gets thrown around as like a real problem when it's not. Another one, by the way, is the in the universe thing. Some entertainment lawyers like using in the universe instead of throughout the world. It really means the exact same thing. It's a finicky thing. There's debates in entertainment law circles all the time about whether or not in the universe makes sense, but we're saying the same thing. It's just like an absurd word choice in that moment.
It is good though for triggering me, because when I've been up late at night chilling out watching conspiracy videos, I'm like, why the universe though? What's going to happen in a few years and be revealed here?
On the moon,
the Musk
maybe
Space
those
League, man.
Maybe those are the next
rights,
Overwatch League spots. The moon, Mars, Venus. We're branching out. You have to understand though, if you come in and it's extra. You're coming in outside of the Earth, you have to pay 20 million more. That's the way it's going to work in that sense. But it's a fantastic model. So everyone from the universe can get involved with the Overwatch League, right? What about this then? So Scoots, one theme that's emerged already is, by implication, is that part of the issue also, as well as team owners themselves not knowing how these things work, people initially just being naive about contracts, is a lot of the problem is players themselves didn't know there was anything wrong or that there could be anything done about these things, or they didn't understand the terms themselves. And I know from being friends with some players over the years, I've heard some ridiculous stories that were just basically all on them. Like I knew a StarCraft player, Scoots, might have played for one of the orgs related to your business at the time, and he signed a contract. And when he did the contract, he told me the basic terms. I was like, sounds like a pretty good deal. You're getting good money there. And I said, but you have agreed to do like a ridiculous amount of streaming hours here. You're traveling all the time. You're going to tournaments. And he was like, yeah, but I had to agree to the streaming hours to get more money. And I was like, okay. So then, as you could expect, fast forward about 6 months, and he hadn't done his streaming hours, and he somehow felt, Scoots, like this was unfair that he would have to do the streaming hours because, well, it was like a little kid, wasn't it? He's like, I've already spent the money, haven't I? It's like, there was no motivation to do them. He already had the money. So in his mind, he was even saying stuff like, yeah, but I came top 4 this last tournament. I was like, I don't really think that's relevant. Like, they're going to want you to do the hours, aren't they? So the question is this, Scoots. Back in the day, I noticed either there was compromise or these players tended to be the ones that buckled because they're so scared that, this contract can be enforced, or, I'm going to lose my job. And a lot of them didn't even know what the punishments were, sometimes they were quite vague. Back in the Evil Geniuses days, did you ever actually have to enforce these things against people? Was usually just telling people, we've got this on contract enough. Did things ever go to court?
No. You mean like actual court?
Yeah.
No, not on either side. I actually, unrelated to EG, I actually wish that over the years more of this stuff would have been walked in and out of court via somebody, whether a player side or a tournament organizer or a sponsor or a team owner, because that helps define this stuff. But no, never. Never in my tenure at EG, and I certainly don't think of any tenure at EG where there was any actual legal on either side for us to a player or a player to us. Now, did we fine players? Did we hold back money because of streaming hours not met? Yeah, that happened for sure back in the day. And again, you make a deal with a player, and of course, team side hat. You make a deal with a player. You hope they understand the deal like you understand the deal, the ramifications of it. To your point, streaming hours equal more money because exposure is how we get paid by Twitch to pay you that salary in the first place. That is this revolving wheel that I want to kind of get team owners off of too, of less of the non-play the game shit to get paid, right? But that comes with revenue streams, right? But go back to EG days, right? Streaming was big, really big back in those StarCraft days, right? So it had a team house full of streamer players, right? So anyway, no court, but certainly fines and like reprimands and like, angry conversations about, you wanted this, you said you would do this, you're not holding up your end of the agreement, I think that happens with all probably owners and their players. And of course, team hat side, everybody's, did you not read this? Did you not have someone look at this? Like, and even back then we didn't have a Bryce. We didn't have a real esports lawyer. Alex knew some guys, right, that helped us, right? And finesse legalese throughout the years, but certainly wasn't a dedicated esports guy as far as I know. And our players, I don't think, really reached out to them very often, kind of maybe ahead of the curve. So, yeah. And again, that's kind of that cycle is, yeah, we'll pay you more money if you do this, all these other sponsor obligations. But those at the end of the day, and this is where my buddy Alex and I, and not to deflect against what EG stood for and what we did as a business, because again, I wore that hat. But these were the biggest fights and arguments that Alex and I always had were over player shit. Because I would be on the side of pay him less and take this shit out. Because don't we want them to win? But it was that compromise. Well, he wants more money and I'm not going to give it to him. So he's got to, because we got to get paid too, right? To get that money from Twitch, they just don't give it to you. Right? Or a Steel Series. So, but I was always that battle. Like the more non-playing they do, the less we're going to win. Right? Are we here to win or are we here to be a marketing agency? Right? And that is a big debate that team owners have to this day. Noah alluded to that conversation. Is it an entertainment company or is it a thing built to win shit? Right? They're not necessarily the exact same thing. And we wrestled with it, certainly. Alex and Colin on the business side, me on the player right side. Even back then, like, no, man. But, I mean, ask Tommy, prime example. We paid the Counter-Strike guys way more than they were worth. So they would quit their jobs, not be part-time, so we could try to beat Europeans in 1.6, right? We hired Tommy, all those things, right? Still wasn't enough, right? And he could also tell you some horrendous stories, right? In regards to players doing silly shit. Anyway, so, yeah, no legal stuff. I don't know if again, back to that point, I don't know if, forget EG. I don't know if anybody has sued anybody. I don't know if Fnatic's ever been sued. SK's like I maybe you don't hear much about it, right?
It's happened on really, really small scale. Maelstrom got sued for the Martin Shkreli stuff, right?
Okay. Fair enough.
But we can count on one hand the number of examples, and it's really small time stuff like that. I think the reality around litigation is, that was what I did in my past life. When I was building my esports practice, I was also a general commercial litigator, and when new clients come through the door, the first thing you do with them is set expectations around budget. We were the third largest firm in Seattle, but Seattle's not a particularly big market, so we were probably mid-firm pricing, and we're quoting them hundreds of thousands of dollars. If you're talking about like working with a white shoe law firm in the United States on major complex commercial litigation, you're talking about millions of dollars in lawyer fees. So the notion that you could sue,
by the way, so obviously, I think why we take more to court here in Europe, just because fees are quite limited and you really know exactly what you're getting yourself into, right? And I think for esports particularly, it's brilliant because sometimes you want to have that decision from the judges actually saying, okay, listen, this is something new, but you have to play by the rules just as everybody else. Sorry.
Okay.
And you also have a loser pays system, so you can file suit knowing that you are right and expect at the end of the rainbow you're recouping all those fees. The U.S. is not a loser pays system, except for in the case where you're suing under certain statutes that do some fee shifting. So unless you have an affirmative right under whatever your cause of action is to claim attorney's fees, then you're not going to get them. And even if you have that affirmative right, oftentimes the judge will grant them to you, but they'll lop them off. You'll wind up getting 40% of what you paid in fees. So you win the lawsuit, you win $300,000, but you netted 2 horrible years and minus $400,000 because of all the costs.
Sure, but I mean it's a bit similar here. So if you choose to go with a firm that bills you by the hour, or you will end up with loads of fees. Obviously, I'm not going to deny that, and you can't recoup them, and you can only recoup what's actually the statutory average. It's still not bad, I believe, but probably nothing any lawyer working in esports charges. So yeah.
Okay, so as you touched on there, Bryce, obviously a reason in the past that these things didn't go to court is it was prohibitive in terms of cost. The sheer amount that you might even be able to win and the amount it will certainly cost were massive. But another aspect, obviously in the context of how esports worked, and it was very much a day-to-day business, is it's prohibitive in how much time it might take as well. Like, do you really want, if you're running a Counter-Strike team and it's with this one player out of the 5, do you really want to drag that out for 2 years? Whereas, in Counter-Strike, that might be your entire org's history and how successful you're going to be, and then what's going to happen with the other team. And, it's not a business that's just going to stop and wait for all this to go on. And I actually always wondered, if it had ever happened, how leagues would even have treated that, because in theory you'd need the league to agree to not let the player play if he's not in your team, etc. And these are all questions that in the past, without the game devs, were far from decided. So what about this then? Does the fact that now people hear about contracts that are worth millions, and the potential, obviously we've seen with some of the teams how much they're making from the investment and the massive amounts of revenue that are starting to flow in, have we now reached the point where some of these things will or should be going to court? It should be actually being seen. Some of these contracts should be tested, or are those prohibitive elements still there? What would you say?
Well, I think the cost. Sorry, go for it if you want.
No, I think I just want to make a couple of points that have not so much to do with the cost, but other things. Okay. I think in esports, one thing is esports is moving incredibly fast. So no matter whether you're a player, an org, or a league organizer, whatever it is, if you don't get something resolved rather quickly, and if you don't have an arbitration modus, for example, it might not be worth it, because we all know it. We have seen it all over esports, defamatory statements, for example. The question is always, do you really want to do something about it, or do you just shut up and move on? In 5 days, everybody has forgotten about it. Okay, so, we move so quickly that sometimes it might not be worth it. The other thing is also, in esports, since, the structure is very heavily on the top side with, the publishers having the IP rights, and therefore all the leverage in this industry. If you want to fight with someone who's above you in the food chain, is this really something you want to take on? Because, obviously everybody is dependent on everybody in this business. And sometimes it might be rather worth it to, find a compromise, even if it's bitter for you in that moment. But, just swallow the bitter pill and move on, because otherwise you might be out of business for good. And that might be, whether this is, a player who poisons the water, or a team, not so much for the game publishers probably when it comes to their behavior. But I think these are, good points to consider. And I think, probably Bryce can say a lot to, alternate resolutions when it comes to, disputes in esports. And maybe, court is not the right thing for many reasons. But then again, as always in esports, we all have to work together and agree on a modus, just because we're all so close.
Yeah, look, there's a very real kind of opportunity to win the battle but lose the war as relates to your relationships in the industry and suing somebody. That's true in any small industry. It's definitely true in esports. Thorin, definitely contract values have gone up over the last few years. They're going up exponentially. It feels like they're doubling year over year or more. At the very highest level, I could see a world in which the amount of controversy, dispute on one of these contracts is sufficient to warrant litigation, but really only at the upper 1%. And even then, we're like teetering. It's like maybe it's there, right? When you're talking about commercial litigation, we really are talking about disputes in the millions of dollars. Like, can you litigate over smaller amounts of money? You definitely can. The economics rarely make sense. And in the US, even if we're talking about litigating, right, like over 98% of cases in the U.S. settle, and there's a reason for that. Litigation is ridiculously expensive, and it's and not to mention the fact that it's like the worst. Like I cannot over stress enough just how miserable lawsuits are and how much you do not want to be in them, even if you think you are in the right. The number of times you have a client come in and be like, I want to do this because this is right. I want to sue them, and I don't care how long it takes. I don't care how much it costs. And then you like give them their week to take a beat, and then you go back to them like, no, but really this is terrible and you do not want to be doing this. It's a very real phenomenon. So I still don't think we're there. Obviously, you start to see litigation now in traditional sports where, you know, Tom Brady gets suspended for 4 games and that we're talking about millions of dollars just for his 4 games, not to mention the broader ramifications for his career and his life. So it is worth litigating over that, but we're a far cry from that still. I think we will get there eventually, but we're not there. The other point that we talked a lot about is the time associated with litigation, right? There's a reason why in traditional sports, like before Tom Brady goes to court to sue in emergency procedures, by the way, like he's not just in a standard piece of litigation. He's trying to get an injunction against the league from enforcing its penalty, which is in the courts a way of like severely expediting what is happening. You're not asking for money damages. You're saying this person is wronging me legally, and I want to get a court order to stop them from doing something or to do a certain thing, depending on what's going on. Okay. But there's a reason why in all traditional sports they have alternative dispute resolution mechanisms in place, right? As it turns out, like going to war in the court for 3 years is not really going to solve an immediate problem as it relates to a suspension or players' eligibility or a host of other problems that come up in traditional sports and now come up in esports, right? So I beat the drum for this a lot. We're starting to see the industry trend in this direction a little bit with some of the new league rules that have been put into place. And I would love to see us go more in that direction because the court system just is not an adequate opportunity to, redress a grievance in 90% of disputes in sports or esports.
Also, just because it's unfair, because esports is so international, so many disputes you're going to have are across a couple of jurisdictions. They're very complex. So you can only go, with top-notch international litigators to actually represent you. And who's actually going to who's actually sophisticated enough in esports to work, with this kind of representation. I would probably a handful of teams, I would say, maybe a couple more, and then obviously tournament organizers because they're very used to, interface with many jurisdictions, but still, this is not accessible for the normal player or, let's say, the mid-sized team. It's just not.
Okay.
I think one more thing on lawsuits. If I were to put my prediction hat in, I would actually say that one of the first big public lawsuit we might see in our space is going to be it's going to be not player team. It's going to be team sponsor, team VeXii investment, sold a bill of goods, not happy with what they got, or team league. Franchise upsetness, maybe not these franchises that exist now, maybe the next set of ones. I don't think, to Bryce's point, the median price of a player contract isn't worth the legal dispute process of really either side probably dragging it out. I think what is really cool, though, in the year and a half since PA blew up, right, which kind of, I guess, more publicly put forth that I care about players and blah, 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 right?
Thanks again for ruining my vacation. I appreciate you.
Anytime.
I always said that. It did happen on Christmas, for fuck's sake. It's how we live our lives.
I would like to point out, for Bryce, it happened on Christmas. For Scott and the players, it started before Thanksgiving. So we lost 2 holidays in that little fucking debacle. But out of that, I think came some great shit. Yeah. So I lost 2 holidays over helping the damn players. Point being, in the last year and a half, and this is really encouraging to me, I have had more players, not only Counter-Strike players, obviously lots of Counter-Strike players, but certainly other people that know me or have heard of me or have knew someone who knew me and said he talked to Scoots, have asked me about, and Anna can attest to this because I reach out to Anna all the time, like, do you know a lawyer in this country? The point being, in this last year and a half, more than my entire existence in esports, I've had players reach out to me about finding them proper legal advice. And some are like, Scoots, can you look at this? And I'm always like, I'll look at it. I know what it's going to look like, and I'm not a lawyer and I'm not going to represent you. You can now afford a lawyer. Get one. Let me help you, right? So that's really encouraging to me because that keeps us out of courtrooms, right? If the player side can be properly represented to not only it is not only to defend the player rights and to fight for all the player, it's to help educate the player on what he's actually signing. Just like Bryce is educating the team on what they're having the players sign. It goes both ways, right? So half the battle is the players being educated of this is what you're giving up, this is what you're not giving up, and here's your resolutions when things go south, right? And having not your dad, not your uncle, not your brother who like dropped out of law school look at your shit is really important. So really, really encouraging that, like, out of the woodwork, different countries, people that I don't even know, teams I don't know, players reaching out, owners reaching out saying, hey, my very first contract, I don't want it to be shitty. How do I make sure it's not shitty? Well, look at this one to start and go from there, right? So I think that keeps us on a compromising, working out the ecosystem. And again, obviously I care about Counter-Strike, right? So it just, I think it helps grow this side of it up, right? Players being educated that, yeah, you signed a one-sided deal this time maybe, but now when you go in next time, you know what this clause means, and call her, by the way, because she represents people in Germany, and she'll make sure you don't have to sign this one again, right? Those kind of things.
Sure, and I will take you through the contract for hours and hours and hours and ask again, are you really sure, you want to do the streaming obligation? Just, tell me, how was it in your past? Is this actually something, you regularly commit to or not? It's really, I think it's all about in that sector also just to talk it through and just make case scenarios real, because when you have the abstract text in front of you, usually, players can't really imagine what can happen, what can go wrong. And I think nowadays we're even seeing, kind of a change, because I believe what you said, Scoots, earlier, nowadays competition is so fierce on the top, and you really have to perform at the top level to maintain all the sponsorship dollars, and to have all the eyeballs on you. So, I think most teams come nowadays to the conclusion that, yes, you have to fulfill your sponsorship obligations, but during season, all players do is, train, perform, rest, and that's it, just because they have to perform at the peak level all the time.
Okay. What about this then, Anna? So something that was alluded to earlier was that obviously since the main business model of esports has been sponsorship dollars for everyone, whether that's the tournament organizer, the team, and then obviously the player gets his through the team, it's meant that unlike the traditional sports model where you play for a team but you have an agent who represents your rights, and so for example you can have 2 or 3 players on one team who have different shoe brands in a sport, or obviously all the luxury items that are outside of the sport, often they represent in different sports around the world. But in esports, basically, the analogy people started to give a few years back was like the team's basically your agent. Like they just take over everyone's rights, and that's what they're selling. That's basically all they're selling in a way. I mean, you could technically go to the tournament yourself anyway. And so until you reach a point where it's all franchised, actually at the moment, you could make a case it's somewhat tenuous for the teams. I mean, in theory, unless they own a slot in the league, you could just leave them as soon as your contract ends and you could still compete without them. So I ask you this specifically to start off with. Is that actually going to be something that is an avenue that people will go down in esports? Like, will it start to be that like really big name players, rather than sign a contract with a new team, they will somehow, this is what they'll use the leverage for at this point in time. Like maybe they'll take less, but to have some rights of their own that they can have sold separately, and then they can have a totally different mouse sponsorship or whatever it might be. Is that actually going to happen? Or do you think is the whole model of esports basically too predicated on the idea that the team has to have everyone's rights? That's basically what they exist for at the moment. What would you say?
No, I think it's absolutely parallel to sport. When you, for example, look around and look at football teams in Europe, most of, let's say, the average, even above average players, they don't have their personal endorsement. It's completely normal, that they get a very high salary, and they usually don't have, the personal endorsement with, let's say, Adidas instead of Nike, shoes, for example, right?
Sure.
And I think in esports, we will just see the very same, we already have it that sometimes, you have this one player, he's this outstanding player, and they get their personal endorsement. And we will definitely see this, and this is a job, for their representatives, their agents, their lawyers, to see where are those deals, that you can anticipate, and also get the carve out at the very beginning, when you sign the contract and make sure, okay. But honestly, on the other hand, usually I would say it's even in the interest of the team to, grant your player to get this, massive personal endorsement, just because the attention, this creates amongst your fan base and basically everyone will be huge. So I think usually it should be a win-win.
Okay.
So, I have a lot of thoughts on this. I apologize in advance if I talk for too long. I think the way that Scoots was framing this up earlier is really good, where he was talking about the fight that he was having with Garfield, where he was like, let's pay the players less money and ask for less rights. If they want to go monetize themselves via sponsors or media rights or whatever, we can let them do that. Let's just focus on like the sports part of this. That's actually the right mentality, and I see that never. Whenever I have these negotiations with players, representatives like Anna and many others, Ryan Morrison's of the world, you name it. Whenever I have this conversation, it on some level it feels divorced from reality to me, because like on the one hand, like yes, Anna, there is a benefit to a superstar player having some, being sponsored by Mercedes-Benz and going off and doing their thing on their own. That's great. And I think, by the way, to answer your original question, Thorin, like it is inevitable that we will get to there. But if you look at the economic realities of esports, we're not there yet, and I'm not sure we're that close, right? Like if you were to break down the P&L of a stick and ball sports team, okay, they are making money from sponsorships, yes. They are making money from media rights, yes. But they also have a local media rights deal. They have local endorsements. They own or rent a venue where they sell advertisements. They have concession and gate for the stadium, right? The list goes on and on and on of revenue streams that are available to traditional sports teams that esports teams simply do not have in 2018. So while someday I fully believe that we will have localized teams and they will have venues and they will have these additional revenue streams from their local TV deal, or it probably won't be TV, but it'll be a local media rights deal of some kind that's targeting their jurisdiction, right? It'll be live streaming in some way, or maybe they just sell it bundle it up and they have additional rights to sell to Twitch or whoever. That's fine too, right? Local endorsement deals, actually being able to sell tickets to their venue, sell food and alcohol to the people who show up to their venue, etc. When we get there, then it will make more sense for teams to cede some of these rights. Or they could cede them now and just pay the players way less money. But in 2018, if you look at the P&L of an esports team, anywhere from 40, let's say 30 on the really, really low end, probably closer to 40, 50%, all the way up to 90, 95% of their revenue streams are sponsorships. As long as that is true.
And nobody says you should, see these rights for free. Obviously,
sure.
I think it's always...
People do. People say it all the time.
Yeah,
People
but that's crazy. I think it's always, it's a give and take, you have to see, and obviously you're completely right. In Europe, it's just the very same that, you have a very limited source of revenue streams. That's just the economic reality of esports. I would say, yes, teams could have been faster in, getting to other revenue streams, but honestly, it's probably the biggest miss by game publishers so far. I personally believe that you actually have to make use of these media rights. You have to monetize them, and obviously, as a game publisher, you don't feel the pressure as much as the teams. So you have more time, to create your system and wrap your head around it. But
what do you mean by that? Like, what should they be doing in this sense? What's the implication?
Oh, the implication is just, when you look at those franchise leagues we now have, or, long-term partnerships, or whatever you want to call them, it has taken quite some time to actually get there. And it seems to be the only model currently where people believe, okay, we can take this as a product and we, have an inventory that belongs to this product. We can sell to sponsors, but we can also sell the product itself to, to media outlets, to, TV stations, to platforms all over the internet. And honestly, I think it has just taken, probably you would say by TV years, it's like we were light years ahead. I think in esports years, you could have hoped that this, would happen a bit faster, just because, for so many years in esports now, we have been talking about the eyeballs on esports. who cares? We need to find a way how to get the money for these eyeballs. And okay, I'm ranting, I'm sorry. But I just believe, the entire economic system would be a lot healthier if the top of the system had been a bit better at monetizing. But on the other hand, it's a learning curve. I completely understand, this is a new product, esports is a disruptor. It takes time to understand how this works. And also, obviously, you have to educate traditional media outlets on esports, and many formats are not suitable to be sold on, to linear TV, for example, just because, just take League of Legends, you don't have the 90 minutes you have in football. It could go on forever. So,
yeah. Well, and I think that's a big point in general. Like, we're talking in a very broad scope of esports, but every one of our esports is very different. Player contracts may be similar in Bryce's language, whether it's a Counter-Strike division or a Dota division or a StarCraft player. But at the end of the day, those ecosystems are dramatically different within themselves, right? And especially the closed lockdown ones are run totally different than the global open one like Counter-Strike. I think you're both right. I think we need to get more towards traditional sports' separation of who has what piece of LeBron James for marketing, and where we are now, where it all belongs with the Cleveland Cavaliers, right? Somewhere along the way, as revenue streams for these teams do get more diverse, I don't know if you'll ever really be making money on real hot dogs, but where are the virtual hot dogs, right? What is that next step? We have merch. What are those other things that we can replace? Because here's, again, going back to my EG experiences, all I have as a team owner, I always felt we had two brands to build: our team brand and every player that wore our jersey, right? Because if we made them superstars, we were on their shoulders, right? We worked together, right? If they sucked, we sucked, right? Vice versa, right? Obviously, bleed blue, maybe more heavy on the team side than the player side. Player cares more about the player, and a little bit of the jerseys they're wearing. It goes both ways. But so I always felt that our job was to market the shit out of them, right? Not just our brand, right? To get Jordan wearing Gunners and get him on a billboard and do all this crazy shit, right? But what I would like to see happen, Bryce, is where rights are owned or signed away to a team, but they're not activating on them. Let's figure out those gray areas and figure out how to give those back, right? Because there are categories. Because what no team does is acts like a real agency, because they're not built to. Cloud9, 50 players, Liquid, 50, 60 players. They are not built as an agency to individually handle them as if they were, right? If they were, IMG or whoever, right? As an agent for a player, right? They're not built that way. They're not supposed to be. But they own kind of the world, like, and maybe not all of them, not all players have the exact same contract, but they grab that scope as if they are the agent of record, safe to say, right? But since they're not built to activate properly on it, they can't make maybe all the money they can from the players because they're activated on the big and not the 50 little. So where can we get to quickly where we can go, okay, this category, gotta be team. Entrepreneurial players, all yours. Because right now, there's not a lot of wiggle room to even have an agent discussion, because there's nothing for that kid to even offer an agent to go rep, right? Or very little. And you have to be a superstar player to walk into your office and go, no, I get this, right? Because I want Jack to spend less money. I want Jack to have less labor costs. And Andy and Victor and all those guys, right? Because I know my game is very fucking expensive, right? Whether it should be or not can be debated. The cows come home, but it's a very expensive, top tier esport. If you want good players, you're going to pay a lot per month for them. But I want to be able to be the guy educating them and going, look, you're all going to make less money, but here's how you make it back. Jack's not going to pay you 10 grand a month. He's going to pay you 5. But here's how you can make that difference up if you choose to do it, right? Because I want Jack to still be here, and I want Jack to care about games that maybe are expensive, right? And I use Jack as a euphemism for all team owners, so to speak, right? Because Jack has a very big budget. Jack and I have had conversations about our game being not the most brand-friendly game, right? Try to explain that to a player. Try to explain that to a player who's lived the life of Counter-Strike. Oh, yeah, that game, they really sometimes do have a hard time getting money for it. What do you mean? Did you see the major numbers? Did you see what E-League posted? Yeah, I did. But let's talk about the reality of it versus Fortnite and these other games, right? So that's my part of the deal with the Player Association is a couple more contract cycles of maybe figuring out how to do this compromise. Pay less, give back, right? And of course, a player association in traditional sports has a collective bargaining agreement that covers a whole lot of shit that is generally in all your agreements, right? It's just everyone's covered over here. So we don't have to talk about any of this shit. No one has to waste any time for 5 years. So let's talk about this shit between LeBron and the Cavs, right? So we're not going to get there, right? That's a different thing. But if we can get some of that standardized language, like you already have, more towards that. And again, I'm not trying to take money out of Jack's pocket. I'm trying to make Jack more viable, right? Because being a team owner is like this middle wicket, right? If you play Dota, do you need a team owner? If I'm a good team and I've got tournament organizers and I've got Twitch, it's a tough, nebulous spot to be in, team ownership, man. Don't want to ever go back to that. So anyway, a little bit of a rant. Sorry, Thorin.
No. I think it's, look, this is like the most interesting conversation in all of esports, because these the economic interdynamics between the teams and the players, which get layered on sponsors and the media rights and the leagues and all this stuff. It's fascinating. And there's multiple answers to this question, by the way. The reason we've talked about this a couple of times, we talked about the kind of superstar phenomenon. The reason why the default in traditional sports is that these rights are basically exclusively held by the players, and the teams are just paying you to compete, not paying for your name, image, likeness rights vis-a-vis their sponsors, is because of superstars who recognize that they can be paid way more money on their own. So what really happens in these ecosystems is superstars probably make slightly less, assuming they're able to monetize themselves well. Let's put that aside for a second, because if we're being honest, in 2018 in esports, there are not that many agents out there, certainly not that many good agents out there who are really capable of going out and truly selling a Bjergsen or a Faker or, insert whatever famous esports player you want from any game you want. Like, not that many of them would actually be sold very well. So I actually think these players are probably better off to a certain extent right now, bundling up and selling vis-a-vis these teams who are, in many cases, very good at doing that. That being said, let's fast forward 10 years to a world in which video games are so mainstream that it's accepted. I'm no longer beating my head against the wall of explaining to big brands oh yes, people watch video games for a living, right? we've come a little ways over the last few years, but there's still a long way to go before it's a slam dunk decision that brands are just going to activate in gaming because it's the right demographic and it's a thing that everybody accepts and it's the way to go, right? So all that being said, when we get there, it's going to benefit superstars way more than it's going to benefit your tier 2 and tier 3 players, because what's going to happen is Jack, continue to use Jack as the hypothetical team owner, Jack, Steve, Andy, whoever, is going to reduce their compensation to everybody, and some of the players are going to be able to make up and exceed whatever that salary gap was, and a lot of them are not going to be able to make it up at all, or they'll make it up a little bit, but not that much. So these systems right now, what is happening, Scoots, when you're talking about giving back some of that inventory, I get where you're coming from, but it's really an opportunity cost purchase more than it's an actual activation, right? They're maintaining rights to this category so they can go sell against it in the next 6 months, not knowing if they're going to be able to close a deal in that category. And if you have your superstar player go out and get a deal in that category because they've got one offhand ready to go for them, that's great for them, but now you've made it even harder, if not impossible, for the team to go sell that category org-wide across the bundled inventory that they're paying for. So really what's happening right now in the ecosystem is salaries are more than they can actually economically be justified to be, certainly against just them as esports competitors, say nothing of them as broader media companies, right? Because they're paying for the opportunity cost of, you're not going to have those rights, I'm going to have those rights, I'm going to bundle them, not just with your teammates, but with all of my other competitors. I'm going to create real scale that will appeal to some of these brands, and then I think I'm going to be able to go sell it. That's the way it's built right now. Will we get closer to where traditional sports are? I do believe that we will. I think it's inevitable because of the superstar phenomenon that occurs in all professional sports, including esports. I think it'll take a little ways to get there. And in the meantime, I'm not actually sure the players are better off if in that world. Maybe a few of them are, but that's just
it would go both ways. Guys would take a pay cut, right? They'd have less work on their plate, but they would take a pay cut for it. So again, being a player advocate, it's not always pay them more, work them less. This survives with compromise as this grows, right? That's the only way. There's no doubt about it.
And this is the tough thing about collective bargaining agreements, is that you're negotiating on behalf of a huge block of players, all of whom have different interests. The players at the very end want protection around guaranteed contracts, and I want the minimum league salary to be higher. The players at the top are I want more rights, I want more flexibility. I want, this is, it was the absurdity of when people were criticizing Kobe Bryant at the end of his career for signing a max deal, and it's hey, don't you want to win? And it's Yeah, but I'm already, because of the CBA, I'm already taking an outrageous pay cut against what I'm worth, right? I'm worth $65 million a year, and they can only give me 20. So why would I go from 20 to 10? Are you people insane? It's I already did that sacrifice. It was called the collective bargaining agreement, right? So these interdynamics among players, we talk about players like they're this amorphous body of people with the same interests. They are really, really not.
Oh, for sure. Trust me, it's hurting cats. I know this firsthand.
Yeah.
Similar cats.
Yeah.
And I think a revenue area that also might help this, as we're starting to see these last couple of years, is the tournament organizers, right? As they're finding they're fighting their feet, and at the same time, the team owners are the ones that are pushing this, saying, okay, you want long-term deals with us? Let's have rev share. Let's figure this out. So obviously the players are like, well, why don't we figure out our rev share, and then maybe you, instead of you taking my piece and then giving it to me later, pay me less. I get my direct cut from this league, that league, the other thing. Obviously, you get in the franchise world of Overwatch and LCS, probably a little different on how they're doing rev shares, especially in the beginning of these endeavors. But again, I see these other revenue streams that maybe, again, player entrepreneurial might make more. Lazy guy, probably going to make a little less, but also have less things to worry about too, right? So then somewhere in the middle, you're a well-informed player with lots of options. You make a decision, right?
Sure. I mean, maybe one thing to consider with, I think generally we probably can say that salaries for some are higher than they probably should be, because they're just not economically justifiable, in all honesty. But it's not only, the image rights that are attached, or any right that can be commercialized, right away. It's also about the scarcity of top players. Currently we operate in an ecosystem where you can't replace a player just like that. Your team, they're not, like in football, 11 players and you have another, 15 on the bench or whatever. You have to operate with a tightly knit team. And sometimes you need to get this very one player to make your team work. And you won't be the only team interested in that player. And obviously with the help, of agents and other support staff, players are much more informed about, their value just deriving from that scarcity. And let's be honest, I can't blame anyone for leveraging that. But honestly, it puts sometimes orgs in very unfortunate positions. And, in all honesty, it damages overall the ecosystem in the short term, for sure.
Okay, right. I thought a good final topic to talk about, since the episode's about player contracts, is the buyout issue, because this is one that there hasn't actually been a lot of content on. I think a lot of people are unsure. So, Bryce, just as a complete layman coming in, I'll ask the naive question that every fan asks when they hear about one of these buyouts, which is, how does it even work? We've seen there's contracts where there's no figure listed, and then people don't know. Does that mean the team can just say any amount? I mean, I've heard of ones where, the player was making X and then per month, and then the buyout was 100 times X, and it's for a year. Would that even work in a scenario where this got took to court and somehow he could show, I've got an offer that's incredible from this other org, but they're not willing to pay this buyout that I'm getting asked for, that may be too much? How would even the basics of that work? Can you give us the lay of the land?
Yeah, for sure. So let's start with the basic premise that regardless of if there's nothing in the contract whatsoever about buying it out, a buyout is always on the table, right? So if you really want to leave, you can always go to your contractor and say, hey, contracting party, I want out. Technically, I have to play for you for another 6 months. What if I gave you $200? Would we be okay? Can we mutually terminate? Right? It's a basic settlement agreement. I'm going to stop performing services early. In exchange, I'm willing to give you X. Buyouts in esports oftentimes, and that happens all the time, by the way, my default templates, just so everybody knows, do not include buyouts. The reason for that is because I hate them. I think they make no logical sense at all. The notion that you could upfront negotiate the value of someone's contract a year from now, 2 years from now, doesn't make any sense to me. It's totally divorced from reality. A lot of times the buyout number should go down, but it doesn't, because you had some number in there and we thought they were going to be more valuable. Sometimes it should go up. I don't really get it. I get that players want to have that flexibility, but at the end of the day, there's other ways to cook in flexibility aside from buyouts. That being said, let's live in a world in which we're talking about a contract that does have a buyout. Now I want to know what it says. This was a thing that came up a lot when the SK roster was shuffling around, and there was the simple rumors, right? And people were getting so mad at Na'Vi. I haven't seen that contract. I don't know what it says. I don't know whether or not they comply with the terms of the buyout contract. But this is why I really firmly do not believe in that contract jail is a thing. If you have a buyout that says you have the right at any time to terminate this agreement with or without cause by paying the team $50,000, period. If that's what the language says, then you pay them the $50,000 and you walk away. And they have no right to hold you there because you have a clear contractual right to walk away. If your contract says you may discuss a buyout with your team that could be $50,000 or some amount to be negotiated by the team and third party, whatever, it's like, you don't really have a buyout. You have some amorphous reference to some negotiation that could occur at a later point in time. I don't believe any organization has an obligation to release a player just because they want to go. Certainly, if not, if it's going to hurt them economically. That's the high level lay of the land. I could ramble on forever. I'll let the others chime in too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anna, come on.
Well, look, in Europe, it's very complex, for one, because we have a very long history of, how football economics work, how you have these, millions and millions, invested in player transfers or loans, this is a very advanced system. And by the way, I think, esports to this date has really not understood how to actually monetize that. Why not, hoarding more players and loan them to other clubs, or why not develop more players and then, and on the transfer fees, but that's just by the way. So going to these, buyouts, again, it depends very much on the jurisdiction. So for example, in Spain, in sports contracts in Spain, you have to have a buyout. It's statutory law, you have to have it. And this is why you have a case where, Neymar for almost 300 million, goes to PSG because that was in his contract. PSG was willing to pay that amount, so the player's gone, and and that's it. In other countries, for example, in Germany, you have to be very careful. I would never recommend having a buyout because, besides whether it makes sense or not, what Bryce just says, here it's very problematic with a buyout whether it's actually valid to have a clause like that, and that could torpedo your entire contract. Because, in some jurisdictions, people look at these buyout clauses and they're like, these are actually, penalties. And they're, they can be so immense that the entire contract is invalid. And, why would you ever take actually a risk as an owner, for example, putting a clause like that in there? And in the end, I agree with Bryce, if you're in a situation where you want out, it's always about the creative way of finding a compromise where both parties are happy. And usually money makes people happy to a certain degree. So you will find an agreement where somebody pays some money so you get off the hook. And yes, in the end, you can call this transfer fee. You can call this sometimes it's a settlement fee because, sometimes people really argue about a couple of things. But in the end, I also believe, transfer fees are nothing bad. As I said, I think it's a very legit way of, monetizing what you actually invest into player development over time. I think this is also something we haven't addressed yet, but, I might pick up, an up and coming player at the age of 17 and will invest a lot of money. That player will start out with Twitter with 5K followers, right? And you take this player to 300,000 followers, so the entire value of the player on the on the image rights side, but also his own player development in terms of skill, evolves. And in the end, you should be able to also cash out on that as well, I believe.
Okay.
So, speaking of people that farmed players, Ryu from Selfless did it for a couple of years. He was actually a good farm team owner, like not a malicious negative thing. Like he found a bunch of up and comers, and molded them, contracted them, paid them decently, but then would sell them to tier one. Right? He was our little farm system, literally, and he was publicly aware of it in the sense of like talked about it. Like he knew that's what he was providing. Like the first step, he knew he didn't have the money to have a tier one team rostered, but he could find those next set of kids, right? And he did for a while. But I think that's not a way to run an MGO though, right? Off of transfer money. But he made some money to help keep it going for a little while. And I think there's a place for both. It's funny because I wrote down before the show like what's most important to me in a contract when people have me look at a contract. In case you ask that, and it's my first one I always ask is how long is it? How long do they want you for? Is it a year? Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? Like, what crazy shit are they throwing at? Usually it's a year or two, right? And then right below that, buyout/exit clauses. How do you get in? How long are you in? And how do you get out? Again, from player mindset, how do you get out? Or how does the team get rid of you, right? There's two sides of that, right? There's got to be a way for a team to end it and a way for a player to end it. I agree with Bryce in the sense of if you set a number, that can be great for a player. But it can also be bad for a player and bad for the business, right? If you set it too low and that kid has a superstar year and you have invested, he lived in your training facility, went to Alienware's training facility every day for 2 years. Alienware spent money. Everyone spent money on him. And then he bails because you only put 10 grand in there and he's got like 11 months on his contract. Ouch, right? Because you deserve something back.
Yes.
And a lot of people will look at it and go, okay, it should be how much is literally left on the contract. The kid gets paid X amount a month times X amount a month, plus a fee, plus a percentage. But that's, again, to Bryce's point, that's a really intangible percentage. So why even have it, right? I like the idea of it being kind of not in there either, but there's got to be a way for a player to have a duress to get out. Can't just go, nope, don't want to play for you anymore. Fuck my teammates, because that's not fair to anybody either. But a buyout clause with a set number makes that at least very well defined, no ambiguity. It's $100,000 to get this kid out, whether it's 1 month in or 11 months in. So I kind of like that too because there's no gray, right? But this is that kind of thing, to Bryce's point, that probably should have a gray because he might be worth more or he might be worth less. What I would like to see is to make sure both sides get paid for it. If you sell me, I want a piece of that sale too. Because yes, you're making a final piece of profit on me, but how about, and I can't remember if there's a slice in there for players generally on this, but that would be nice as a parting gift. Like, all right, I just made $100,000 on you. Here's your 5% of that. Away we go. We're good. You know, and I don't know if you do that, Bryce, if players ever get a piece of it, because they sweat equity. Because they sweat equity into that too, right? As well, like they helped build that brand, just like they helped the brand build them, right? Goes both ways.
Yeah, it definitely happens sometimes. Overwatch League, you know, Robbie, who's senior esports counsel for Blizzard, was talking about this issue extensively, actually, at the Esports Bar Association, little plug, last week. And one of the things he talked about was this: it's actually standard requirement in all Overwatch League contracts that any transfer fee, a certain percentage of that goes to the player. So it's definitely not unheard of. It makes sense to me. I think it depends on the context for the player and the percentages and all that stuff. That was always in the details. But yeah, conceptually, I think it makes a heck of a lot of sense. Certainly makes more sense to me than like this player has an absolute right to walk away for this amount of money without knowing what's going to happen 2 years from now. Yeah, because both sides get burned on that, right? For sure. And I think another thing to think about is, you know, open world versus a closed league system where you can have set regulations like you just said. They're able to set a Overwatch League industry standard for a set of contracts, right? No ifs, ands, or buts. This goes in all your goddamn contracts, right? It'd be neat if the open esports was a little bit more like that, where we as committee came up with some shit that just goes in all of them. So we stopped talking about some of this kind of stuff, right? But buyouts, I just think there needs to be a way to get out. And again, not just like I don't want to play for you anymore, right? Now, one thing I would bring up now more than ever is if you look at the owners as building businesses, right? They are business owners. They have stakes. They might even have stakeholders in their businesses now. They are sweat equitying their way in to a bigger payday, right? Players have no piece of any of this business, right? Just like they don't in sports generally, right? They are paid workers, right? So there is something to be said for overpaying a worker because I'm investing towards getting millions of dollars on the back end of all this, right? Like, again, you can look at players that played for EG that helped build that brand that left even after I was, you know, even when I was still there, but they helped build those brands, right? So somewhere along the way, I'm a little bit okay with, like,
if someone's going to risk a business, someone's going to make a little less money, someone's going to roll those dice, it shouldn't be the players when it comes to the team side of it, because they unless you start sharing with them and literally rev sharing the business, which maybe is a whole different conversation, like rev sharing to keep long-term players happy and franchised in your system. What if they are actually, not EG owns their team, but like Cloud9 players had slices, and maybe they do, maybe they don't, I don't know. But again, sharing the pie and figuring out this kind of compromise situation, right? Again, teaching players that you can't walk away, there are ramifications, but here's how you can get out, right?
Okay.
I think so. I think we're already there, right? Like in 2018, in many esports, I don't want to say all, I don't want to cast it, I don't want to do the broad brush thing, but in many esports, many players are significantly overpaid in relation to the amount of revenue that they can generate right now. You can put some of that on the teams, like the teams aren't generating enough. That's true for some. Others are actually phenomenal at revenue generation. And the reason, by the way, is because of artificial markets, right? Like investment money has poured in. You have a lot of people that are fighting for pole position. It's not about making money on their esports team in 2018. It's about building $1 billion asset in 2040. And so, I think what you're describing, Scoots, is literally happening as we speak, as teams jockey to become the number one team brand in esports. That's how you can justify some of the unbelievable salary inflation that has happened over the last few years. It certainly hasn't been justified by revenue upticks, which have gone up for sure, but have not been commensurate with the salary increases.
Yeah. But let's not forget, obviously, the teams and players we have to do with, on a daily basis are usually on the very top, of the ecosystem we're looking at. So I believe, for example, in Europe, we have now a very lively, healthy, how do you want to call it, grassroots movement, as well as, basically a business that is being built between the very top pro level, and the grassroots level where people, just go to clubs and they play, one afternoon per week with each other. Mm-hmm. And let's call them semi-pros, or just, not top tier pros. And those guys, they're making the money, our pros, our clients, made probably like 3-4 years ago. And for them, sometimes it can be the end of the career if their club, for example, asks for, a buyout of 5k euros, okay? Just because it will be impossible for another club, in that bracket of teams to pay that, and then that player basically might rot away forever. And I believe, there is this entire bracket of teams and players where it would help a lot to have a couple of minimum standards, which actually, help players, for example, to have higher mobility, for example, and just fairer treatment. So yes, obviously on the very top, I think most of what I've heard is right. But I think there is another area that still needs a lot of help.
Sure. Okay. Because one problem I can see in this area is like when you see the public reaction to these buyouts, unfortunately, it's usually a fan who likes the idea of the move. He wants this player to go to this new team, or it's the player himself. And understandably, yes, the player wants to go to the new team. But the part I see is really difficult if it's not set is that on the one hand, you have to ask, like, well, what's the best case scenario for the team owner? I'll give you the example, okay? The best example I can think of in the last few years that typifies this buyout issue is when Nico was on Mouse Sports in CSGO. Because they picked up a player who came from a country no one's ever known to have any competence in esports, and they got this player, and he turned out to be much, much better than anyone could have known. And so if you're Mouse Sports, you just hit the lottery. That's exactly what you were hoping for when you pick up a young player like that he becomes maybe the best player in the world. So for you, understandably, well, yeah, if you've got a contract for 2 years, whatever it might be, you want him to play for you for 2 years. That's the best possible chance for your team to do really well in Counter-Strike. You won't, no matter what amount of money you get from him, you probably won't be able to sign a player who's equivalent value in the game when you do the deal. But on the other side of the equation, if you're Nico, and you become one of the best players in the world over the span of a year, and you know that there's literally, I mean, I could give you 10 names of teams that would pay you maybe 5 or 10 times what you get paid in mouse sports. It doesn't make sense for you either to want to stay in mouse sports. It's a worse team and you're going to get paid less. So how you resolve that, I mean, obviously that's what this entire field is about, but it's not really fair for anyone, that equation. I mean, it's going to be difficult to find what that number would be or what the terms would be, right?
Yeah, and I mean, look, sometimes you have a good ending to the story, you know, and the player moves on to better and higher things, you know, and the career develops further. But, you know, I also have a couple of cases, obviously I can't name them now, but where you actually see pros who are on the verge of really being like this, you know, famous superstar in the making. Some of them get so frustrated sometimes by these situations that they might drop out. They will just stop because it's so stressful, you know, to survive a situation like that. And again, I personally believe, and that is of course a European view, but I believe a little bit of regulation to situations like this, you know, wouldn't hurt. Just, you know, to have, for example, fair mechanisms to resolve something like this, or at least, you know, adopt existing jurisdiction from sports, because we're talking about scenarios which have been played through courts in Europe 1,000 times. You know, it's like there has been this tradition, for example, in Germany that you know, you had to, if you want to take a player you know, from a team that has developed that player from a very early age on, you had to pay a buyout. You know, it was actually called a development fee. You know, obviously later on the courts, for example, decided, you know, this is not really fair because it also creates a lock-in situation. So in the end, you know, I think at least German courts rule in favor of high, you know, employee mobility, that, you know, people can move around and you can't lock them in forever unless, you know, you compensate them fairly. So you should be able to avoid a situation where somebody's locked in, you know, in a contract where they're not getting paid what they would get paid in the other team. So, but anyway, still a lot of work to do, I'd say. Okay.
Right. Bryce, I have a question for you, which is again one of these classic questions which probably isn't easy to answer, but I'm not the one answering it. So here's the question. In esports, one thing that's quite weird is I've seen this phenomenon. So I'll just make this hypothetical for now. Let's imagine I've seen this phenomenon, Bryce, where a team announced that they were selling a player for a certain amount of money. So we'll just make it an imaginary amount. You know, we'll say $100,000. And the other team said, yes, we have bought this player for $100,000. But everyone I know behind the scenes says that no one ever exchanged $100,000. Maybe it was $50,000. Maybe it was less. What is the situation there if we have people essentially publicizing terms of a deal that might not actually have taken place in that sense?
Well, I think in that we have to assume there's no like percentage of the buyout going to the player, that there's not like clear malfeasance where because if that's the case, it's like really easy, right? They're just like
basically
lying.
It just sounded like they
save them money.
Yes. They
right?
just basically, you know, the person selling wanted to sound like they sold for a lot, and then you know, maybe in a scenario this where the player was very good,
buyout.
And then the person signing obviously doesn't mind saying, "Oh yeah, I spent a lot more than that. Yeah, I've got a lot of money." You know, you can see why for the vanity of both parties it would make sense. But is this a dangerous area?
Never really thought about it. I've never thought about it before. Off the top of my head, I can't think of what law they would be breaking by mutually agreeing to lie about a buyout amount as long as it's not intended to breach a contract. So like if the player was entitled to a percentage of the buyout and you're lying down in order to make them get paid less money or something. But outside of that, I can't think of a reason why that would not be acceptable. I will say that oftentimes buyout figures play into the negotiation with the player representative. And so I'm not aware of in a single situation which one of my clients lied about it. And if they ever came to me to talk about it, I would say, if you're going to announce the number, announce the real number. Otherwise, don't announce the number at all. I don't know why we're announcing a number, but the reason it makes me like really skeptical is because I think the number one reason why you would want to do that PR thing is so that when you go to the player or their representative, you can say, I spent $100,000 on you. There's no, even though I would have paid $12,000 a month for you, now I can only pay 10 because there's $100,000 that's gone. What am I going to do, right? And so I'm really not wild about it from that context. That's the only thing, the only way I can really think of it, though. If it's literally not affecting future negotiations and it's not affecting how much a player was played before and everybody just wants to pat themselves on the back for like having a larger buyout, I don't really care. I can't think of a law it's breaking.
Okay.
It just goes along with all the other esports stats that are fluffed in esports, though, Thorin. New zoo buyouts 2.0.
But you have to be really careful. I'm not so sure. This is only an ethical issue. Because I could see scenarios where it impacts evaluations of teams. Where it impacts. Actually where people put value to certain, actors in the space. And, you have to be very careful that you're not in a gray area where it's actually, saying all of a sudden you're defrauding people. I mean, not necessarily, a party that obviously if you're in on it, but, not telling the public the truth. I think it can have in certain scenarios negative.
Well, it's certainly disingenuous. There's no doubt about it in that sense, because again, it could set the norm for a level of player that is an absolute bullshit number, right?
Yeah.
So outside the PR funness of the two guys doing it,
and also
part of the idea, I assume, is to like affect the market.
Yeah, sure. But, if you affect, we all know this, with stock trading, if you're doing shit, that's not true, that actually affects the value. It circles back to you. And I also think you also have to be careful because, we talked a lot about, revenue sharing and whether, once you start, for example, not being honest about the number that's supposed to go back in a pot or redistributed or whatever, you might raise not only eyebrows, but
legality. Get
in serious trouble when it comes to that, obviously.
But lying on revenue sharing disclosure obligations is just a breach of the contract. So it's a different hypothetical. I mean, I agree. Like I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't recommend that someone do it. There's all sorts of negative ramifications we can come up with. I just can't think of what law that people would be breaking.
If you rely on it, it's fraud. So it would be criminal.
It would be criminal fraud to say I bought a player for $50,000 when in fact you bought him for $100,000.
Like something in the context of revenue sharing with the league.
But I agree. But that's also, I mean, in the U.S. it's not criminal fraud most likely, but you're clearly in breach of contract, and you're breaching a whole bunch of implied and explicit duties in the contract. In addition, just breaching the obligation to pay the correct amount of money. But that's kind of different hypothetical. I guess I was thinking about it purely from what is the harm just associated with the announcement. For you, the party that's lying. You're right. There's a ton of trickle-down implications associated with it.
I think a bigger worry, Thorin, and maybe not so much now in this era than a few years ago, would have been the idea of two owners colluding, not for a PR buyout number, but colluding on buying the player, period, because they're mates and they will save each other. Instead of getting into a bidding war, Team A and Team B agree that Team B will buy said player. And Team A will walk away from negotiations. Those things happened. And whether they still happen, I don't really know.
Sure.
But I have heard too many horror stories of that exact scenario of literally owner collusion. That shit scares me. This, two guys getting together and going, hey, let's say we paid $100,000. That'll be great. Everyone will laugh. I'm less worried about that grayness than an owner going, oh, you're bidding for this guy too? I tell you what, mate, you do this for me, he's yours. Right? And again, that shit has happened. And that scares me.
Yeah, I mean that's why it's important.
That would be criminal.
That we get bigger, and there are not only 5 owners, but 20. Because the bigger the competition is, the more vivid is your market, and the less is the chance that happens. And I think we in esports are actually really good, despite the opinion of many fans out there when it comes to handling. Multiple ownership, for example, in contrast to traditional sports in Europe, at least, the rules in some of the leagues are incredibly strict. So rights rules, for example, are stricter than the UEFA leagues, rules, sorry. So And I know, everything is always scandalized when it happens. So the Fnatic loan, for example, that happened with Jens Hilgers, who's also, an owner in G2. But in the end, I would say these rules exist exactly for, what we're discussing here, that people are not colluding because they will, earn something on multiple ends of a deal, just on one end. And I think that's also something, important moving forward, that we make sure that, we remain as, strict as we are right now moving forward.
Okay. So obviously in traditional sports, you can literally find out what the payroll is of a team. You can find out how much someone was signed for. You can find out how much their buyout is. This will all be standard information within press release, within the newspaper report about it. Why is this not the case in esports? Like, why is no one bragging about selling the player?
Sometimes, but you also have, the football leagues page, which is honestly a very interesting page to read when you want to learn, about football deals. So I think it's not always publicized, but I think this is something where a direction, at least I would advocate to go into, to have more market transparency, to know what's going on. And also, that actually the entire system is audited a bit better. We talked at the very beginning about independent contractors and employees. Obviously, in most professional leagues, we're having employees nowadays. How the German Football Association is handling these. All German football clubs get audited by the association at the end of the year, and and they take a very close look at the finances. And I think this is something in esports that would be important too. But obviously, when it comes to salaries and transfer fees, that should probably be information accessible to everyone. And I understand that certain groups in the industry are very threatened by this because they thrive on the asymmetry of the market. And that is fair too. If you have a fantastic network and everybody and you know what's going on in the market, yes, you can take advantage of. But here in our case, it's about player welfare and players not getting played too hard by the market or friends. So I think transparency is key moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, Noah Winston beat this drum like a year ago, and like nobody lined up behind him, and the issue kind of died.
I like the way he did it though, because if you remember what he did was he said like, "Oh, I love the way Ember have released theirs. I won't be doing it myself though, but we should all do it though. If we could all just do it now, I'll do it as soon as all you guys do it. No one's doing it. Yeah, okay, I'm out. Like he did it in a very clever manner, I have to say.
It was. He philosophically believes that it's the right thing to do, but he wasn't prepared to shoot his own business in the foot if nobody else was going to get in line with that particular idea, which I think is it's actually like a beautiful encapsulation of who Noah is as a human being. I digress though. Look, I probably have, if I had to bet, there's no one alive who has more information about totality of player salaries in esports than me, because I see it across all the games across a bunch of different teams. And I oftentimes scratch my head about the number that I'm asked to put in contracts both ways. I'm like, I bet you would love to know that you could have gotten this player for half as much money, or the other way, like, wow, what a steal on this player. Like, this is way out of line with the market. I am pro transparency. I would love to see the industry trend in this direction. I advocate for it behind the scenes all the time with my clients. I think actually more team owners are for this than you would think. I've never done a head count of 50-50 or more, but I think they're all in a situation where no one wants to just throw it. Like, okay, Ember's numbers were PR garbage, BS. Like, they were overcompensating. It was ridiculous. Okay. Everyone saw it as the stunt that it was. In general, I think no team wants to be the first team gone on a limb. If somehow you get a group of teams to go out and do it, I think it would be a great thing. I would love to see it happen across the industry. Anne is right. Like in European football, these numbers are not public. They're leaked a lot and oftentimes criticized for being inaccurate. But in traditional U.S. sports, they're all public. And I just think I just think the entire market is better off with actually everyone having the information, because by the by, oftentimes team owners think they have the information, and as it turns out, team owners are lying to each other about it. Like, say the buyout thing. This player is getting paid X amount a month, and then I'm like, that number, where did you get that number from? And it's like, oh, I got it from the team owner. I'm like, okay.
Yeah, you get in terrible situations if you know the actual number, and all you can do is just, zip it, because obviously you can't disclose it. But sometimes it's really crazy how much is, lied in this business, and it's really dog eat dog. There is no,
I think transparency net, like everybody wins. You wind up with actual fair compensation relative to the marketplace across the board for talent. You give talent the opportunity to point at a player and say X, but you also give teams that same opportunity. If a player expects $250,000 a year and you're like, yeah, but you were like statistically the, 7th best jungler or 4th best entry fragger who speaks English or whatever, and like this is how much those salaries are, I think it's probably a net positive for the industry as a whole. It's just about how to get there. I honestly don't have a good answer for that part.
Okay. Yeah, it's also really hard, because if you look, for example, at the game publishers to do it, right? Because the publishers or league organizers are usually what in the traditional sports world, the associations are, they're the regulators of the space. But, why would they actually, invest a lot of money to make the market transparent? Their interests, go only so far when it comes to building infrastructure. And as Bryce says, I think, this is also very much a question of, how you play your part of game theory, right? And you can't be the first one, to lose an advantage in the market. So it's just everybody teaming up, or it won't get resolved.
Scoots, what do you think on this topic?
I mean, I definitely agree. I know, again, I have to keep harking back to EG, because again, it's all I know as a team owner. I often had angry conversations with our players because they misunderstood the business we were running. And the perception of how much money we had and the reality of how much money we really didn't have, right? And it was a constant struggle. Every time we announced a sponsor, every time we announced anything, players would be like, but does that mean, wait, so $500 more a month, right? Because you just landed Monster, right? That's how that works. It's like, no, let me show you the fucking red sheet over here of everything that costs money, and the little bit of green over here of the money coming in. So to that point, player education. Not only would they, if their salaries and transfer fees were public, then obviously they would instantly know whether they want to agree with the ego assessment of their skill level. They would have several ways to look at where they rate financially in the ecosystem, right? They might think they're a better offer than they are, is what I mean. So they might look up here for what they should get paid, but they'd have something, right? I'm also a fan for, like, again, back to Jack. The more Jack shares with his players the struggle of being Jack and Jack's big team of staff now, right? The struggle of running that business, the more they're sympathetic to bumps in the road of a team owner, right? Less team owner bumps probably now than there were back then, but we had months where we were like, hey, didn't get the Steel Series check, guys. Let me explain to you why we can't pay you. It wasn't like, oh, I'm not going to pay you. Like, they're human. If you explain to them the situation you're going through together, they often will be compassionate, right? So I think the more players who think that all this VC's coming in, and ESL got bought by millions of dollars, and DreamHack got bought by millions of dollars, and Turner's here, and Jack's got millions of dollars, and all this venture capital sports money's coming in, doesn't mean that Jack's building mansions and swimming in 5 swimming pools, right? So I like the idea of maybe not public transparency in this stuff, Bryce, but like private team owner to their player base transparency, because maybe that helps some of these situations where they think one thing and it's so goddamn opposite of reality, but they get all wound up over it, right? And again, just education, right?
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, earlier I got fired up about like the perspective of, and it was like at Anna, but it wasn't directed at Anna, right? It was like directed at the various player representatives and players that I have conversations with that are like divorced from the economic realities of the world in which they live. And it's like, and it's not, and I can explain it in broad strokes, right? I can give like this percentage of P&L and stuff, but like actually making it really concrete such that they understand, I think would go a long way towards people really kind of getting what's going on economically in this industry, which is we are built on a tidal wave of investment and it's not a trickling faucet anymore. It's like a slow dribbling faucet of revenue, which we're all getting better. We're getting better at tapping into it. We're educating. Like the money is. I bet my whole career on this. Like I believe this is where the ball is going. I look at all of the headwinds traditional sports are facing, and they're all tailwinds for us. So it's just I don't need to convert like a baseball fan into an esports fan, right? Like the trope I give at sports conferences whenever I talk to them, which most people hate, but I love, is like every day a baseball fan dies and two esports fans are born. So like I'm good with all of this all this trend stuff, but I do think oftentimes like people get caught up in this investment deal happened or like this major non-innovative brand into the space, and they just miss where we are today, which is a relatively small economic pie that is being divided in a bunch of different ways. And so I do agree, if we can get if people were willing to be more transparent, I think if all the cards were on the table, actually we would be in way better shape. But the game theory that Andrew's talking about is very real. Like people don't want to put their cards on the table because they want to maintain their competitive advantages, and so we are where we are.
This video was supported by Dean Tanglis, Gardner Wilson, Andreas Snazore Westerlund, Alex Adams, Mikkel Hansen, Bash, Daniel Yordanov, Yordan Tsenkov, TTMXMP, VeXii, HawpT, Robert Baxter, Travis Greb, and a special thanks to Jerky's Minion. Do you want to get teasers for my upcoming work? Find out who's coming next, what topics are being discussed? Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest to appear on one of my shows or in one of my videos? Would you like to ask a question in my monthly Patreon AMA, or perhaps even discuss esports as part of a discussion show I run on a monthly basis? Donators can also discuss the topics expounded upon in my videos with me and the other patrons on our Patreon page. All of this and more at the Patreon link below.